Right. Welcome to the session. This afternoon session is called the Indian Act and the Legacy for First Nations Students. And it is brought to you by ARPDC, the Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortia, and we're funded through Learn Alberta. Let's do a land acknowledgement. Tansei, I live on Treaty 7 land. I'm here in Calgary, which is the ancestral home of the Blackfoot people. There are also Dene here in Tsuut'ina, as well as Métis Nation Districts 5, which I belong to, and 6 people here as well. All have contributed to the shaping of Alberta and Canada. I do thank the Blackfoot for sharing this land with me and allowing me to live here. And if you know which treaty land or ancestral home you live on, you can pop that in the chat if you want. I try to keep an eye on the chat too if you have questions during the presentation. Some more people have popped in. Treaty 6, welcome. I'm originally from Treaty 1 land, actually, and the Métis homelands. I'm Red River Métis, from what is historically known as the Red River Settlement. Let's see, somebody else has popped one in the chat. Treaty 6 as well. Thank you, darling. And my family is from Selkirk, Manitoba, which is just north of Winnipeg. For those who are Indigenous who are here, you know the two main questions we ask people are, what's your name and where are you from? So who are your people and what is your land? And so my mother's a Mowat, that is her maiden name. I was raised by my grandparents mostly. My grandpa was a Mowat. McDonald's, Mackay, and Beaudry as well. And the Beaudrys are actually a Métis voyageur family from Alberta. And my family spent time in northern Alberta. And so you'll see there's a picture of my great grandpa there, James Mowat, the gentleman sitting on the bench by the rocks there. And in Fort Saskatchewan, where they had a homestead as well as they had one in Fort Edmonton, there's a school named after him, James Mowat Elementary, and Mowat Park is there, as well as a street in Edmonton, James Mowat Trail. And I also have a family member who was on Riel's council. He's the one standing behind Riel with his face down. I always laugh because I always think ADHD runs deep in my family. He was probably waiting for a long time. I got bored and looked down just as they were taking the picture. So anyway, I have been working with Indigenous students for all of my career. I started off in Winnipeg teaching in the same school division that I graduated from in Seven Oaks School Division. And I was teaching in the core area of Winnipeg, which if anybody's been there knows, it was on Main Street. And so I started that work back then as being the only Indigenous teacher in the school at the time. And then I moved to Calgary almost 30 years ago. I've worked in all different areas of education except for, I say, high school math and science, which nobody would want me to do anyway. A couple of years ago, I got into this work specifically, though, working at taking a contract with Kataskanau Tribal Council in an online school, Ignite eLearning. And they had tasked me with taking their outreach program for grades 7 to 9 and indigenizing it for their cultures, decolonizing it, adding land-based learning. It was also based on the seasons, so fall, winter, spring. It was also so that all the kids could work together on their different activities across the grades if possible, so finding those commonalities, and then adding the Cree language. I had a great deal of help in an advisory capacity from their specialists there, so they were amazing. Once I was done the work and I handed it over, their elders were very pleased with the work that I did. And so I was encouraged to continue on with this kind of work. So the two kind of main things that I do, one is with ERLC and doing presentations about Indigenous issues, in particular like this one. But also when the main focus is infusing Indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum. And then I also do other contract work with Bow Valley College. I've done work with Edmonton SPCA in different places to advise them and or create curriculum for different areas that involve Indigenous ways of knowing or just indigenizing curriculum, period, and decolonizing it. So I welcome you. I do not have all the answers. I always tell everybody I know lots of people who have lots of knowledge and information. I'm very blessed to have elders that I know and culture bearers and knowledge keepers and people that I can ask questions of and that I'm learning from, and friends, of course, that have their own teachings of all different backgrounds. And here in Calgary, the Indigenous community is pretty diverse. People from across Canada, I have friends who are Inuit as well, which is really cool because I'm learning a lot more about their culture from them, because that's an area that I feel like I don't know very much at all, other than what I learned as a child when my grandparents were living there. My adopted grandpa was assistant commissioner of Northwest Territories for a time, but it was a very long time ago, of course, and I like to learn from the people themselves, right? They can teach me, so I'm learning that. That's really cool. Anyways, I welcome you. And I'm just going to go over the ARPDC resources quickly for the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit area, because these have already been created by Alberta teachers, can't speak, I've been talking all afternoon, I apologize, for Alberta teachers. And it's interesting, I find even when I'm doing presentations in person that many teachers aren't aware of these resources, and they're really good. So just to let you know, this is Empowering the Spirit. It is an entire website, but it has so much information in it. Each one of these links goes very thoroughly deep into each subject area. There's tons of stuff. And when I'm researching different topics myself for presentation, I find these are on all kinds of post-secondary websites for especially education programs. They're on library services and you name it. And I've even seen it referenced in the States. So there's lots of good stuff in here. My particular favorite, and I always point this out, and sorry if you've heard this, Orange Shirt Day and Beyond, because under the teaching tools section, which I'm not going to go to, I don't have time to do that, but there are leveled posters by division for different things such as sharing circles or Orange Shirt Day and that sort of thing. So that's really good to know. And then under the search engine itself, I apologize. You can go to find resources by focus. And so, of course, this is for anything that you're looking for, any subject matter you're looking for, but I'm looking for the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, which is at the bottom. And of course, it brings up every resource that's available in that area. There's lots of them. And you may notice, if you've been around as a teacher for a while, that publications such as Our Way is a Valid Way, and Education is Our Buffalo, and then, of course, it does reference Empowering the Spirit website again is there. So lots of those, but they're available in PDFs here. You can search by audience, you can search by level, or by type. So yeah, there's lots of good stuff there. So I always tell people you should start there because there's lots of really good information for teachers, and it's already created. So why not start there? I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction beforehand. This is just a brief one from the Canadian government, actually, just kind of giving an overall introduction to the Indian Act, and then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty about what it really is.
Mm, 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 mm.
Yeah, I apologize when I said that. It was the Canadian Encyclopedia. And I love the Canadian Encyclopedia. I have to say, it's a really great resource. I've used it a lot, even just when doing curriculum development. It's always updated. It's one of those sites that's like Wikipedia in a sense. Not just anybody can go in there, but you can share new information and new articles and things like that with them. I think it's a great resource for students as well when they're researching. There's lots of things that they can look for on there. Um, I guess I asked before I get into it in great detail if anybody was surprised by any of the things that were shown in that video to begin with, if there was anything that you were surprised to learn about the Indian Act. Pop it in the chat if you want. You guys knew all that stuff. I often wonder because in talking to Canadians in general, like I do volunteer work. I'm in different places. I do different things my not only just in my work but in my personal life. And I'm always interested to find out what people do and do not know. And I don't think that a lot of them actually know a lot about the Indian Act and how it has affected First Nations peoples. And then, of course, for teachers to know how it's affected our students in terms of their lifestyle or what has gone on in their lives. Um, and I don't know if going back and talking about that Royal Proclamation, right, from I think it was George, oh, I can't remember which one he was, but I think it was first or second. Sarah has a comment here. She read the book. Oh, you read the book by Bob Joseph a couple years ago. Yeah, and then to think of it still law, exactly. Yeah, and I've taken these things from his website. As a matter of fact, I love to promote Bob Joseph. I think he's got some really great stuff. But just to start off, to understand that the Indian Act itself isn't a legal document in terms of when it was enacted. Canada was still under British rule, even though we were a country. We were granted our own country, as calling it Canada, but we were tethered to England, and in a certain way we still are, obviously, with our laws having to be ceremoniously passed by the king or whomever, right? And having a governor general and lieutenant governors in our provinces, that sort of thing, is a layover from the British system. But our laws follow the British system, but also the British North America Act was still under enforcement when Canada became a country. And Queen Victoria wasn't this magnanimous queen who granted us, our ability to have our own country because, she was being this wonderful, you know, person is like, oh no, it's okay, you can be free, you can have your own country. Canada had really become a burden to them. They'd taken all the resources that they wanted, and there's nothing left for them to take, and it was costing them more to maintain, um, you know, army, things like that in this country than it was to keep it. And so she let go of it more as a financial decision. And so when that happened and we formed a country, Johnny MacDonald took the opportunity at that point then to totally disregard what England had set out in terms of, providing for Indigenous peoples. And so America had already done this because they had severed ties with England. And so what they did with Indigenous peoples was completely on them. The Royal Proclamation no longer applied to them. But King George had said that Indigenous peoples would be left alone, that they'd be left on their land, and that we would share it with them, essentially, that their culture would be untouched. So the Indian Act itself is a document that we can't get rid of because it's tied, and you'll see, to all of the things that First Nations people have in terms of, having unfortunately being numbered people, right, to have a status. But it did a number of things because it was illegal as well, but it changed life forever for First Nations people here in Canada. So this is from 21 Things You Should Know About the Indian Act, but I took it from an article. But Bob Joseph's website, if you have the chance to go check it out, he's got an amazing consulting company in Ontario. And there's tons of videos and things like that on there, just explaining things about Indigenous peoples that are really, really great. So if you have a chance to check it out, I just like to promote him because there's lots of good stuff on there. But I'll get into this and explain the background of this. So if you don't know, the Indian Act denied women's status. So women only had status, well, they didn't actually have status, but they stayed on the reserve and they were counted as part of a family under the men that were there. It did introduce residential schools, like it said in that little video. It created reserves, so reserve land to take Indigenous peoples off of their homeland, their native areas, and put them into areas that were not feasible for hunting or growing or anything that had been done in the past. It renamed all Indigenous peoples with European names. So their own name was taken away and they were given colonized names. It also restricted First Nations people from leaving reserves without permission from an Indian agent. And many times they were denied. And if they did leave, sometimes they left. And first of all, if an Indian agent changed or they decided to change their mind, when that person tried to come back, they had no idea if they would actually still have a home and if they could come back, because sometimes they were told they were no longer allowed and they were no longer status. It enforced enfranchisement of any First Nation admitted to universities. So, if they decided to try to better themselves, they would lose status. You'll see many things, right? Any way that you tried to improve your life, you would be denied being a First Nations person or an Indian. It could expropriate portions of reserves for roads, railways, and other public works. And this happened particularly, they did this all the time, but after men served in world wars, they would come back and the government would actually sell off pieces of reserves to farming areas. So if you know of people who have farms that are right against reserve land, that land was given away to non-Indigenous people from that land that was already cut down from what First Nations people had and then sold as a farm area. And they come back and they would have lost more land. Again, they could lease out or uncultivated reserve lands to non-First Nations people too. So again, this is besides selling it, they could also lease it out for farming or pasture without asking at all. It also forbade First Nations people from forming political organizations. And so this is part of what you'll notice happening in the 60s and 70s, particularly. There's a number of movements that start to occur with Indigenous peoples across North America, Turtle Island, in terms of protests and looking for rights and things like that. And that's really comes out of a product of fighting against a lot of this stuff that's happened, but it was also illegal essentially for them to do that. The government could no longer do anything about it because everybody at that point was protesting anything that was wrong. It also prohibited anyone who was First Nation or non-First Nation from getting help, from legal help, right, without a special license from the Superintendent General. So guess what? If it was anything that was going to fight against Canada, they were not going to get that ability to do that. It also prohibited the sale of alcohol to First Nations or ammunition. Pool hall holders would not allow First Nations people to enter. So this is interesting, as well as a Métis person, because a lot of our people, especially like my grandpa, looked very Indigenous. He looked Cree, and so he would also have been denied going in because of the color of his skin, even though he was Métis. It imposed the band council system, and I don't think a lot of people realize that the system of government that's been imposed across Canada is not a natural First Nations system to operate, and it's caused a lot of havoc, and as many people can see in terms of what has happened. First Nations people were not allowed to speak their native language or practice their spirituality. It also forbade them from being able to dance in public, to show exhibit, stampede, or pageant wearing traditional regalia. So people had to hide anything they did, and they could be jailed. And probably if they were jailed, they wouldn't return, because usually if you disappeared, you were gone for good a lot of the time. I know friends that have said even sweat lodges, which I go to all the time, those were outlawed as well. So anything where you were practicing your traditional spirituality and included anything that had to do with song or dance was outlawed. Potlatch and cultural ceremonies too, like I said, were illegal. They could not vote. You had to have a permit system so that they could sell products from farms. So it caused a lot of poverty because they were mostly denied doing that. And then it also created under the British rule, calling, everybody Aboriginal peoples, unfortunately. And even though Métis and Inuit are not included in this, a lot of the time, like I said, because of the way you looked, you might be treated such, especially back before there was any way to trace things and records, and we didn't have DNA tests and all that fun stuff back in the day. So if we look at education, of course, because this is our big focus, right? We're teachers and we're looking at how does this affect our students. So that's what we're going to focus on now that you've got kind of that background about the, basically those 21 things you should know. So sections 114 to 122 is the part that refers to education. So this is important to understand. So through the Act, the Minister of Education, for federally, so this is under the Indian Act because they're not included in our province, although they're expected to follow the program of studies for each province, they're not under the provincial system. So they can enter into agreements for education of Indian children, may operate and maintain schools for those children, may provide for or make regulations, provide transportation, all those things, and the funding to maintain that child at school. And it requires that they attend school from the ages of 6 to 16. And those are still the laws, right? So those are similar to what we have. The problem is, so here's the problem. The Indian Act makes no provision for supporting culturally and linguistically relevant education or quality education. It makes no guarantee for adequate or sustainable funding. So there's also no statement for preschoolers. And then after the age of 16, the government has some supports for post-secondary, but not a whole lot. And I have to say, because a lot of people think the other part of it to the funding, people think comes from their tax dollars as well, but it does not. There is a trust that has been put away since all this went down that was to provide to pay for First Nations peoples on the reserves. It does not come from our tax money in terms of us paying taxes to the Canadian government. It comes from that fund that's invested. Now, given that and saying that, the funding for on reserves for education is, and don't quote me on this, but I know the last time I heard it was around 70% of what kids get in schools in each province, basically, if you look at that way on an overall scale. So there's less funding, first of all. So there are some amazing First Nations out there that have really great educational systems, and then there are others that struggle, and mainly because of their location. Up until now, especially, like, technology is helping that for sure, but it's also hard if you're in a place that's remote to get really good internet access and things like that. And those are also issues that people across the country are having in remote places, but particularly on reserve land, this has become a huge issue. So we'll talk about hindrances to education and success. So this is the interesting thing. And not to say, again, that there aren't First Nations people that have been successful and that are successful people, for sure, on an educational level. But they've had to really fight for that and really want it because of all these different barriers. So here are some of them. And this is a direct link to residential schools that were created from the Indian Act, particularly. So there's obviously the intergenerational trauma from the things that have happened in residential schools. And you guys have all heard about many of the things that have happened to people. Parents distrust the educational system, and obviously good reason, right, for things that have happened to them, unfortunately, as a product of the residential schools, or just not having good experiences at school. And there's lots of non-Indigenous people who have had bad experiences in schools, especially going back in the day. I know when I first started teaching in the late 80s, there were plenty of parents that were, I don't want to talk about this. So I knew I was teaching junior high, and they're like, no, because they'd had bad experiences, and that's what they expected to hear from me as well. It's really hard for some parents if, the majority at that going back in the day, especially, had low educational attainment. And so they can't help their kids with homework if that's the case, right? A lot of have lower income due to lower education or not having lots of jobs in the reserve. Lots of people want to stay, they want to help their community, they want to do better there, but in doing so, sometimes they sacrifice other things. There's crowded housing on many reserves, right? And that means that getting to rest or having a peaceful type of life at that in your home is not always available, unfortunately. And then, of course, like I just mentioned, they're underfunded a lot of the time on reserves. So there's a lot of disrepair. Many are lacking libraries, gyms, and computer labs. And that's not to say for all of them, not every single one, but a good many. And I think it's getting better in a lot of places, but there's still issues. There's also challenges in recruiting, retaining, and housing teachers for on-reserve schools. I know for what I've seen and different schools that I've been to on reserves, or that I've talked to teachers that have been there, many come from Eastern Canada, particularly Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. A lot of those teachers come to reserve, especially here in Alberta, to work. I mean, lots of people come from Newfoundland, period, to work here in Alberta, so it's not a surprise. A lot of people come to work in the oil industry as well. But there's challenges in recruiting and retaining tutors as well, because it's hard to get people to go out into those different areas. Not a lot of people are available in more remote places too. Also, there's a lack of funds for special education instructors, psychologists, and social workers and psychiatrists. And I mean, that goes across the board for reserves, period, a lot of the time. It's hard, man, it's hard to get people in the cities. So think about if you're in a place that's farther away, and if it's a huge cultural difference and you're asking this person to make a huge lifestyle change, where are they going to go? Well, they don't have enough people in the city, so they're going to stay here first, right? And then there's that transportation. And so if they want to go to an off-reserve school, they have to have transportation. And sometimes parents don't have a vehicle, or the kids miss the bus, or the bus ride is a long time. Here in Calgary, I know the kids that come from Sutina to the schools that are even close on the edge of the city, it's an hour ride to school and an hour ride back. So it's a long time for little kids, especially, to be on a bus. There's a lot of racism, right, that you are going to face in off-reserve schools. Parents are reluctant to send their kids away for schooling if they want them to go to the city. It's scary for them, and to have their kids not be with them and that sort of thing. It's scary for the children too. And then there's that lack of connectivity for many remote reserves, and it's hard for online learning, because a lot of people say, well, why don't they do online learning? And they try. I've even been involved in some of that, but the connection sometimes is not awesome. So if we talk about those funding gaps, right? So this is some of that stuff I was talking about. So if we look at, like, in 1996, this is a long time ago now, they capped the national funding formula at 2% per year for all First Nation programs and services. Now that remained in place until 2015, even though the Indigenous population has grown rapidly. Indigenous population in Canada is the fastest growing population, and some of that under the census was people identifying themselves now, particularly as Métis, but also those who had not wanted to be a part of the system are saying now, yes, I am First Nations, I admit it, because back in the day, there was lots of reasons people didn't want to necessarily. But now they say that, like I said, there's like 30% less funding available for them than other schools. So we're looking at about 70% of the funding that other schools get. It did change in 2019. So Indigenous Services Canada now provides guaranteed base funding per student. And it's similar to the base funding that provinces pay. And there's an additional $1,500 per student for funds for language and culture. So this is a good thing, right? So this is what I've noticed in the last little while. And when I worked with KTCA, they were able to focus on language recovery. They were able to focus on land-based learning. They're able to focus on a number of things for their students and looking at ways to encourage their kids to continue in school and to graduate. So that's a really good thing. So there is some positivity happening there for sure, right? But those changes come about slowly because you have to get the right people in place, and it takes some time. And it really depends on where that reserve is located as well, right? Like, for instance, KTCA is close. It's still a bit remote, but it's close enough. You can get to Edmonton and places like that. You can get to some of the bigger places. There are places, say, in, northern Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, that it's pretty tough in some of those places getting in and out of them. You know, there's this one is a good one to look up. And this is on Bob Joseph's website, right? Again, I love to promote his stuff, and this is a very recent article. But lower education, you know, number 2 of 8 key issues for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And so this is coming from him. And so just looking at it, like, he does go over the British North America Act, as I talk about the Constitution Act and talking about the Indian Act, gives you a whole bunch of information. So this links in here if you want to look at it in more detail. But, you know, he does go through a lot of this stuff, you know, that I went over and explained to you, but getting into some really great detail about it. So that link is there if you're interested, once you get the slides, to take a peek at that. And then I do have a link for the new funding and policy approach there from the Canadian website. So if we look at the effects of First Nations education and justice, so we'll talk about, you know, that combination of facts. So educational injustice, meaning the lack of decent education. And I talk about that in the sense that if you look at just clearly the numbers and funding, and you talk about, like I said, some of those factors about being remote and things like that. With that said, people are, especially Indigenous peoples, are very resourceful, right? We always try to do the best we can with whatever we have. And so there have been some amazing people that have come out educated out of reserves. There are some amazingly educated people within even post-secondary that are there and working for their communities and you know, trying to do all that work and help, for sure. But for the majority of people, unfortunately, up until these funding changes started to happen, you look at things that have, the injustice had produced this chronic unemployment for a lot of people because they just don't have that education, unfortunately. There's higher rates of poverty amongst a lot of First Nations people. There's poor housing, right? A lot of the time, because there's intergenerational trauma and things as a residue of residential schools, many of these things have led to substance abuse for many people, family violence, and then poor health, of course, because, you know, when you're impoverished and you have a lower education level, poor health comes with it, right? We don't have the money to eat properly or to exercise properly, or you don't have the knowledge of how to do all those things. So that's really important to understand too. So this is important. So the National Indigenous Economic Development Strategy in 2022, so this is very recent, estimates that if access to education and training for Indigenous peoples became equitable to non-Indigenous peoples, the result would be an additional $8.5 billion in income earned annually by the Indigenous population. So it's important. So this is money that they would have to live. But further, the report states that closing the productivity gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians would lead to an increase of $27.7 billion to Canada's gross domestic product. So I think it's really important to understand, because I know for myself, I look at numbers too. I'm in humanities teachers, but I always look at numbers for things. And I think that's how you sell it to people. And when you can sell it to the Canadian public and say, you know, yes, it's going to cost more to do this, but look at the return, right? Look at the return for us as a people, as Canadians. I think if you can't sell them on the cultural bit and being equitable, I think you can sell them on this. So then we can look at the residential schools legacy. And I think it's important to understand the legacy that comes with this is that it systematically undermined all of our people. So anybody who's Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, it disrupted our families for generations. It caused so many issues. It severed the ties with our cultures, and what was being taught has been lost. So a lot of what was taught from elders and our knowledge keepers and culture bearers was lost, unfortunately, and contributed to that loss of language and culture as well. So I know for myself, my grandpa spoke Cree. I'm learning that now, and I'm, you know, getting close to 60, and I'm glad, very grateful that I'm able to do this. I am, but there's a part of me, and I know in my class, when we are at the end of the last class, we always share what it means to us, and we all end up in tears because it's, why did this have to be like this? You know, it's hard. And so, you know, talking about a lot of these things that happen too is even more so, you know, with residential schools, the kids being removed from their families, they didn't grow up with nurturing family life or the ability to raise and the knowledge to raise their own children and their own families in a healthy way. So that devastating effect really, it had that significant impact on Indigenous communities across the board. And it is considered a form of genocide. It's also epistemicide to have people removed from their land. And there was that try to remove all culture and life worlds. But the good thing is Indigenous people are so resilient. And, like I said, we're the largest growing population in Canada, as well as so many of us are regaining our cultures and learning about it. And so this is a good thing now, even though this has been kind of what's happened. So I'm going to give you something to hear that's more positive. Hopefully if this video doesn't work, because I was having trouble this afternoon, please let me know if you can't hear it.
As First Nations, if you don't know where you have come from or where you came from, how do you expect to know where you're going?
You can hear that okay?
Aboriginal students, they have to be proud of who they are. We have to hang on to our Cree language and culture, because it is very, very important for us to identify ourselves as Native people, First Nations people.
Every now and then I'll hear, well, we have no Indigenous students in our school. And they're not resistant, they're just wondering, well, we have no Indigenous students in our school. And I'll say, number one, you have no self-identified Indigenous students in your school, and not all Indigenous families identify.
And we, Métis, were hiding in plain sight. That's why we had to stay close as families and kinship, protecting each other. You can spot discrimination, you can tell, and the energy that feeds off that person. You can tell when there's going to be an incident.
Back in the residential school days in my life, I had long hair. My parents and grandparents said, okay, well, braid your hair 3 strands. Okay, Ma, Dad, and myself on your left shoulder. And on the other shoulder, the other 3 strands will be the creator, the ceremonies, and the drums. And so when those were cut, I'm sure that not only me, but others were damaged just by that. I guess I would call it a cut from my identity.
We're overcoming colonization, it's now neo-colonialism, the residential school syndrome, a 60 scoop. Now we're going through child welfare to try not be too dramatic about it, but those have had a really negative impact on identity.
When First Nations people can really share their way of life and help others understand, then we can start to communicate. Only when we are honest with each other is when we can really communicate.
Partake in ceremonies like a powwow or round dance, or go to a sun dance, go to a sweat lodge. Get a feeling for who these people are.
I think people need to learn this because they don't fully understand what Indigenous means and what it means to be an Indigenous person. For me personally, it means I have a history. I have respect for more than just people.
There needs to be an understanding of the different rites of passage, for example. There needs to be an understanding of the way in which our Indigenous students sometimes are not in school and the reasons why they're not in school.
Indigenous students need to see the Indigenous leaders. They need to see the people in the school system who are doing well. They need to see the people that have come from their community, having gone through the very same issues in their community, having had the very same background, leading in their schools and being successful in their lives.
So we need to get up and be determined and have that ego, that positive ego to, to succeed in life. You'll never regret it.
So that's part of the education. You need to help our students be proud of who they are, and then be able to say, I'm a proud First Nations, and I want to be this, I want to accomplish this. And I have my 4 directions that it's going to help me and my elders.
Yeah, so that kind of just give out video is just a little bit of wrap up in terms of all the things that I've, presented to you, but in terms of Indigenous peoples themselves presenting that information. So for teachers, I want to give you guys a whole bunch of lesson plans and things like that that you can access if you want to use this in your classroom, particularly depending on the grade that you're working with. There's lots of different things that I have found online that are available that you can access. CBC Radio has a really great one. This one has a teaching guide, as well as it has videos that come along with it. And you see they provide also a slideshow, and there's an ad-free audio for download as well, and activity sheets, and there's a transcript that goes along with this as well. So there's the podcast for it. So that's an entire unit almost on the Indian Act that you can use. There's also one, and it is from BC, but it's still about the Indian Act itself, so there's nothing wrong with looking at that. They have assimilation by legislation is what they call this one. And it is for high school. So that's another area. So I tried to look for different ones that were available across the board. And the BC ones are always really excellent resources. They have, they've been doing this for a long time with Indigenous resources. So they've got it down pat now. And then this one is for younger kids. So this should help as well. So this is the Indian Act facts and worksheet. And an entire section right here, and it explains a little bit about it. It gives some more key facts as well for children. This one is based out of, I believe, Ontario, but again, say the Indian Act, so it's across Canada. It does talk about the Royal Proclamation and a bit more information there as well. So there's that for the younger ones. And then there's an Indigenous Perspectives Education Guide from Historica Canada. And this is another really great website too, besides the Canadian Encyclopedia. And this is amazing because it's a great visual and it's got tons of stuff in it. You can go through on the side, like just click on a particular page and it brings you to it. So it's got sections in it on each area as well. You can go back, looking at the 1980s out across the board. So it takes you across, it's basically a timeline in a document. You can print that out if you want. The Assembly of First Nations has a toolkit as well. This is a really good website to look at too if you've never looked on the Assembly of First Nations. So it's got a unit plan on here, and you can go by province even. It'll pull up the information that's for your particular province, that you can download all of that. And it has information on all these different areas. Lesson 4 is just particularly on the Indian Act, and it includes that too. And then this is, like I said, I found a lot of stuff. This is on Weebly, which I know is an older platform here, but this is the numbered treaties and the Indian Act. And this is a teacher that has come up with the lesson. And I like this too, because it's got some visuals. It includes the medicine wheel to use as well to include with it. It's got an empathy activity so that you can prepare kids and talk about that sort of thing. Because a lot of these are very heavy, issues to bring up with kids, and can be, and you don't want to, and I always say this, you don't want to traumatize them, and you don't want to re-traumatize the Indigenous kids. So whatever way we can look at this and try to teach the facts about it, but add that empathy piece and prepare them for it as well is always good. And then we've got teaching and learning about the Indian Act. This is just a blog spot that a teacher has, but I just thought this has got some really great ideas on it and some really good resources as well to help you. It's got a digital evidence box. That's really cool. And then the history of treaty making modules and talking about the Indian Act and how treaties were formed under that. Oh, and that one's missing and I checked it just a while ago. I will recheck it because I know it's on here somewhere. They've moved it on me. That's what they do. All right. And then I just included some other things for teachers as well, just for that pedagogical base. So this is facinghistory.org. And this is from the researcher curator at the Manitoba Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg. And she's put together some really good resources here as well. And there's some videos that go with it. And there's a transcript and all that stuff. So there's that to include. And I think for older kids, apparently, especially you can include that for high school. Even when I taught grade 9, I would include it. And then I found this video, and it's not super long, but, and I'm not going to go through the entire video for you, but it's a really good one. Just it kind of gives a synopsis of the Indian Act, and it doesn't it doesn't get into the meat and bones quite so much as that one I showed you, which would be obviously more appropriate for high school kids. And then there's also, this is actually an interview with Bob Joseph, so the gentleman that wrote the book and the 21 things that I gave to you at the very beginning. This is an interview with him. It's about 25 minutes long. Again, I would suggest, older kids could handle this, but it's a really good interview with him and explaining things in more detail. And of course, from the First Nations perspective. And then this is an interesting one too. And I thought to include it would be nice. It's the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So going back and looking at that, since it is what has affected our First Nations students and particularly, that legacy for them of this fear of schooling from their parents and, that fear of abuse and all that stuff. And then the last one, again, is facing history, but it's that historical background. And then it ties the two together, the Indian Act and the Indian Residential Schools, and just gives you some documents and talking about that. It also, I think, explains for older kids too why a lot of First Nations people particularly refer to what has happened as genocide, and they can understand that breaking down of culture. And if you're looking for information, talking about epistemicide, if you look under land-based learning, that sort of thing, you'll see more of that information there as well. So, yeah, so I'm going to stop share on that now. And I'm going to do stop record.